Thank you. Thank you for your patience. And we're very excited to hear from Maharaj this evening. Welcome, Maharaj, to Simply Wonderful Fridays. We are so excited to have you here.
Thank you. Oh, nice to see you. So, do you want to introduce perhaps the topic?
Yes, Maharaj, thank you so much. So we are so excited to have H.D.Goswami here. Tonight he will discuss his new novel, Justin Davis, in the context of Gaudiya Vaishnava literary tradition. We will be adding the link into the chat where you can purchase the book. It's out of stock right now, but will be available in stock in a few days. So please be patient. Welcome, Maharaj. Thank you so much for joining us.
That's kind of nice. It's out of stock. That's didn't expect that. So thank you all very much for coming. I'll begin with a sort of a broad context for the more specific act of writing or trying to write a Krishna conscious novel. Inevitably, if we study the history of religions, or just sort of common sociology and sociology of religion, what we find is that inevitably, even a movement or a spiritual society that wants to raise people beyond the material or to bring them to a transcendental platform inevitably has to communicate its message and express its teachings through material objects. For example, right now we're speaking English, and of course, English is a historical language that began at a certain time, and so there are many ways to express oneself in English, and so one has to choose a particular vocabulary, a particular style of speech. Or, for example, it's common throughout religions that people cook food which somehow has some type of spiritual or sacred significance. And so, what food do you cook? And how do you partake of it? Or the same for art or certain kinds of ritual dress, architecture. For example, when people inevitably in any religion try to build or they build certain structures where people can gather and practice that path. And so what kind of architecture do you use? Exactly how do people gather and so on. So the simple point is that inevitably we have, let's say, purely spiritual ideas such as Krishna, that there's a personal God who's infinitely beautiful, and he's inviting us to share his supreme real estate. So, the spiritual world. So there are purely spiritual ideas and there's purely spiritual knowledge, and yet we have material bodies, and so we express and engage those ideas within a particular, you could say, human culture. And the next point I will make, moving along here inexorably, is that inevitably human culture changes, even when it retains, let's say, certain values. For example, there was a time in ancient India when brahmacharis and sannyasis dressed in deerskin, or they simply streaked. They wore nothing. And we know this is a fact fact, because the Bhagavatam actually recommends this. If you read the Bhagavatam, you'll find a number of verses. I know because I looked them all up. You'll find a number of verses that talk about, that say that brahmacharis or sannyasis, those who have sort of a more renounced life, they should wear deerskin or nothing. And yet Lord Chaitanya, who was developing his movement roughly 500 years ago, forbade his followers to wear deerskin because it was no longer culturally appropriate. And not to speak of going naked, which probably was worse than deerskin at the time. And so we can see how times change. And so the challenge for any religious or spiritual movement, the challenge is to preserve, in our case, what we consider to be eternal knowledge, not corrupt it, not change it, not dilute it or add to it, but to express that eternal knowledge through an external culture which effectively communicates with the world we're in. And that includes making people feel comfortable, making people feel this is something I can do. As we know in this age, simply to practice spiritual life is not the easiest thing in the world. It's not like people are beating our doors down saying, I want to practice spiritual life. And so therefore, the Vaishnavas should not add on to the inevitable difficulty of living a spiritual life all kinds of external difficulties, like asking people to dress in ways that they may find publicly embarrassing, or let's say presenting, even in the presentation of literature. So now let's get to literature, because actually, if I don't talk about literature, I won't get paid tonight. I heard this was what is it? I guess sannyasis are on a gig economy, right? Because they just so if we look at literature, we find that also literary taste changes. For example, if you look thousands of years ago at literature, there's a very distinct genre which can be called epic narrative. In Europe, Southern Europe, you have the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer, and of course other books by other people, but the Iliad and the Odyssey were especially prominent. In Northern Europe, Scandinavia, the Song of the Volsung, which is kind of like their Iliad and the Odyssey, not quite on the same level, but and then you have Mahabharata. I'm not saying that Mahabharata is the same as the Iliad and the Odyssey. Obviously, there are significant differences, but in terms of literary genre, it's similar. And so it's a particular type of literary genre which people found compelling and riveting back then. The Iliad and the Odyssey were real blockbusters for centuries in actually throughout the Mediterranean world. And the Mahabharata, of course, has had an extraordinary impact on especially Asian culture, not even just South Asia, but even beyond just South Asia for thousands of years. So, but it's a type of narrative. It's, for example, to compare it to modern literature tends to be much more concerned with individual psychology. And to show that people are not just, let's say, sort of unidimensional, or like Yudhishthira is kind of always indecisive, or Bhima is sort of always, like that old, was that character, the Hulk, it's clobbering time, so I'm not saying that these characters are one-dimensional, they're pure devotees, but the presentation tends to be, so literary taste changes, and it doesn't mean that people back then were inferior. It could be that actually it's the opposite. They were just they were in a higher state of consciousness and didn't need the book to do it all for them. In other words, they could hear what for us would be sort of psychologically somewhat one-dimensional descriptions, and but they got it. I mean, they could grasp the whole person. So whereas we kind of need all these crutches, and like we need the book to tell us a lot more before we can really get into it. So I mean, you could go on and on and on, talk about the difference. And if you look at, for example, 18th century literature in Europe, it's different. 19th century literature, 20th, 21st. So I do not recommend 20th or 21st century literature. But anyway, what you can see is that taste changes. People, they have different approaches, what they want. It's like, for example, if you look at movies, there's a series called on YouTube, well, it's back from 64 and 65. It was called Craft Suspense Theater or something like that. And it's very interesting because, I mean, I study these things for my writing. So if you watch these episodes, I mean, the acting is different. The acting tends to be more theatrical. Are you sure that you have to go now? Yes, I have no choice. It's like nowadays we would think like, what are you doing? But so even in the last 50, 60 years, styles of acting and dialogue and the sort of the dramatic curve of the story, I mean, things change. And so although there are, at the same time, just to balance this, there is literature which kind of stands the test of time and contains certain universal virtues as literature that people may actively read it for centuries. One very good example is Jane Austen, who I think I'm a in terms of learning how to write, big Jane Austen fan. So, and she's more popular than ever. She wrote her books about 200 years ago, actually now a little more than 200 years ago, and yet she's still rising. And so, because people perceive universal elements, the Bhagavad Gita, we still read the Gita, obviously, and the Bhagavatam. So it's kind of this balance between, I mean, certain literatures and certain art in general achieves a type of universality. It's so good that it appeals to people across vast expanses of time and vast geographic expanses. And yet, I would say in general, there is a need, to use the old expression, a crying need. People don't say it anymore, crying shame, a crying need. Anyway, language, it shifts. So, but I saw that there was a real need to take Krishna consciousness and try to present it in literature in a way that would really move people nowadays. Based on, and of course, there are limitations. For example, there's certain kinds of literature I just really don't like and I'm not going to write. So people advise me like, oh, you should, put this in or put that in, but there are things that I just really can't, I'm not comfortable with. I won't, go into all the details of that. So, I mean, it had to be authentic. I had to write it. I wanted to write a novel because I thought novels were so powerful, just the way they affect me. Good novels. I mean, I found that a really, really well-written novel, like some classics, really, I'm talking here about classics, they really moved me. They're very powerful. I had one experience because I was exploring the genre, Yukta Vairagya, as a as a cultural manifestation that we could powerfully use to serve Krishna. So I began listening to audiobooks, and I was listening to one of the great classics of English literature, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And those were the days when they had little cassette players. I mean, some of you may say, like, what's that? But believe me, there used to be a thing called cassette players, and there were little tapes on them. So I was listening, and because, it's a pretty long book, and so I didn't just sit down and listen to the whole thing. I would, on my bookshelf, I had this cassette player, and whenever I had a free moment or, a half hour, I would just push the button and listen to more of Jane Eyre, which I thought was really an extraordinary book. And I remember at one time, I was so much into the story. That I had to go do something. Knowing me, it was probably I had to go eat for the 12th time that day. But anyway, so I had to go do something. And so I stopped the tape, and I it's kind of the spell broke, because, the book kind of puts a spell on you, but it's such a good book. And then I had this realization. It just really came to me in a flash that the world that I was returning to when I stopped the tape and, just go around the house and do whatever I had to do, somehow seemed less real to me than the world in the novel. I felt like I was sort of going down a notch. I was going down a level in terms of just ontological power. So, of course, I wasn't crazy. I knew that's a novel, that Jane Eyre was not a real person, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, of course, obviously I know that. But at the same time, there's a way in which, because a good novel can convey truth about people, about human nature, about God, Jane Eyre actually really, it's a very pious book, and it really, in a sense, God is at the center of the book. And so a powerful novel can bring you into a world which is very real, because the principles are real. And, Prabhupada, I remember he once said, he was doing that philosophy book where first Hayagriva and then Shamasundar first Shamasundar, then Hayagriva. Basically, they would read Cliff's Notes, like 15 minutes before their sessions with Prabhupada. And then they would explain different Western philosophers. And then Prabhupada would respond. So I forget the context or what philosopher they were discussing, but Prabhupada said something like, anything you can imagine exists somewhere. Because if you think of it, the universe, God's creation, Krishna's creation is infinite. There's, millions of universes. And so practically anything the human mind can imagine in terms of a story, in terms of a character, exists somewhere or existed somewhere, because there's just innumerable living beings. And so there is, we could talk philosophically for a long time about the ways in which a really good novel is real. We know it's not, actual history, contemporary or near contemporary history. But there's a sense in which the principles involved, the character that's being described, and the kinds of emotions are things which are real, which are part of the real world. And so, in any case, I have been inspired for some time, or have been convinced that the novel, rightly done, is a very powerful way to convey Krishna consciousness. And so I thought, I'm going to try to write one. And I read several books, like those books you find at bookstores. Do they even have bookstores anymore? Anyway, those books like, writing novels for dummies and stuff like that. Anyway, I read a number of those books by, apparently qualified authors, and I just did it. Actually, technically, Krishna I just really tried to get a blessing from Krishna to be able to do it. And so, and now it's published, and the response has been really great. And even I'm impressed. I mean, I don't think that I did it. I think I was just somehow given that service. That's what Mozart said, by the way. Mozart is, smarter than your average composer. And so Mozart's famous for saying that the music he presented to the world really came to him from heaven. And that was a common understanding back then in the 1600s, 1700s, before the world became more advanced, that that really, if one is a writer or a musician, a composer or an artist or whatever, or even a philosopher really, that the gift has to come from above. It has to come from above. It has to come from heaven. And then you take that gift and then you offer it back. And so this, of course, Krishna describes in the 3rd chapter of the Gita, that idea of receiving a gift and then offering it back. And anyway, I won't go into the whole history of it, how like the Saint Cecilia Day celebration that was held annually in England, the 1600s. I'm not sure how far it went to the 1700s, but all the best artists, the best composers, authors, and everything would meet, and they would have sacred service. There would be a religious aspect to it, and they would offer the best of their art to God. And so, Bach, after every piece, he wrote to the glory of God. And so there really was this understanding in the world that it's a gift. So I'm going over the novel Justin Davis with the Portuguese and Spanish translators. It's being translated into several languages, and so they're reading it in the respective languages. And as they read, I'm following it in English, I catch little things. And I was really impressed. I have to admit, I thought, oh my God, how did I ever write this? And so I think the answer is that the obvious answer is just, it's a blessing. It's not something we can do by ourselves. But I do think that, the novel, it presents life as a whole. It's very holistic because you just show life. And I've noticed that, to quote from one of the teachers in our line, Mary Poppins, a little bit of sugar helps the medicine go down. And so, Mary Poppins Uvacha. So a little bit of medicine, a little bit of sugar helps the medicine go down. So I've noticed that people can accept certain teachings in a sort of a fun, dramatic setting, that principles that they might balk at, they might have trouble accepting if it was just presented to them as theology or as moral philosophy or moral principles. People would not really be super thrilled to hear it. But in the context of a story, I was also inspired by in terms of just how do you do this, I was really inspired by a Steve Martin movie. Gold is where you find it. I forget the name of it. It was about this so-called revival preacher, who's Steve Martin, who's actually a complete fake. And he knew he was just consciously cheating people. And he was traveling around the Midwest with a whole sort of Greyhound type bus. And he would heal people and, have gospel singers and everything. It was all a big fake. The people he healed were actually part of his team. And so, he was conscious, he was like cynically, consciously just kind of ripping people off in the name of religion. And he pulled into some town in the Midwest, and there's a drought, and the people really don't have much money. They're struggling. And the sheriff, played by Liam Neeson, the sheriff knows that he's a fake and really wants to bust him because he thinks these people are poor, they're struggling, you're just exploiting them. You're taking from them money they don't have, they can't afford to give. Anyway, so the movie has a really good ending because I'll just tell you real quickly, spoiler alert. But it makes a point about writing novels, and that is he starts to sort of fall in love with or become attached to a young lady in the town who I guess works in the diner or something. And she's smart, and you know, the sheriff is telling her this guy's a fake, but she's trying to keep an open mind, see for herself, and he's sort of falling for her. And so he's having his big event for all this advertising, all the people, you know, probably in several counties came there. And they have this huge tent and the choir, you know, the chorus and gospel singers and everything. And he's going to do his fake act. But then what happens is right toward the end of it, when he's this girl that he's really kind of falling for, her brother comes in and he's crippled and he wants to be healed. And so Steve Martin's thinking, oh, gee, you know, my God, because he's thinking, I can't heal this, you know, person. I'm a fake. And it's the younger brother of this girl he's falling for. And he throws away his crutches and kind of drags himself up to the stage, and he wants to be healed. But what's really interesting about this movie, about this story, is that because Steve Martin is just like, you know, he's like, you know, doesn't know what to do. But then this boy, he sort of drags himself up and he surrenders to Jesus, and he's actually healed. And obviously it's not done by Steve Martin. So the point I want to make here is that in the context of the movie, because there's all this fun stuff like romance and the sheriff out to get the fake preacher and everything. And so when you see the movie, it's kind of inspiring. Whereas if it was just Sunday morning TV, I mean, a lot of us would never watch it. But because it's in the context of an interesting movie with really good actors, it's like, wow, you know, he was healed. And so, I mean, things like that really convinced me that there are certain things you can do, and perhaps you can only do through that genre. Even a novel, or in my case, so I'm working on Mahabharata right now. And so as a historical novel, because I'm staying within the boundaries of the Bhagavatam, especially. So I'm not, you know, it's not like there's going to be 7 Pandavas or 3 Pandavas, or actually all this happened in Pennsylvania instead of Bharatvarsha. So I'm staying within the boundaries of the Bhagavatam and the Mahabharata, but I'm kind of filling it in, which is something that acharyas have always done in our line. If you look at the commentaries, the writings of Vishwanath Chakravarti or even Bhaktivinoda Thakur, like in the Jaiva Dharma, I don't want to say they fictionalize our teachings, but they let their spiritual imagination go, so they stay within the theological boundaries of our tradition. They don't say anything which is against our principles, but they create stories by their realization. And of course, because Krishna is unlimited and can do unlimited things, I mean, Krishna may actually be there doing those things. And so that's another very important aspect about, I don't want to say fiction, but let's say a novel or a historical novel, which means you stay within the boundaries of the known history, but you fill in a lot of blanks, is that because Krishna is unlimited, I mean, Krishna can really be present there, and Krishna can really be doing those things if he chooses. And people can feel Krishna's presence in the story. So anyway, these are some of the aspects of what I hope is Krishna conscious spiritual novel writing. And of course, there are short stories also. So it's, I hope I've given you some prasadam for thought, food for thought, offered food for thought. And so if you have any questions, perhaps you could present them now. And then I will, try to do, I'll do my best to get a lot of money out of you. Just kidding, that was a joke. So if you have any questions, now's the time.
I have a question, Maharaj.
Yes.
Thank you, Maharaj. This is Rasikendra Das from Houston.
Yeah, I saw your name there on your little here.
So traditionally, we tend to present spiritual truths in a very factual setting, like historical setting, where an actual course of events. So like you said, there have been precedent before, like Vishwanath Chakravarti and Bhaktivinoda Thakur doing almost writing like novels, like Jaiva Dharma. So how is viewed in contemporary modern Vaishnava society if somebody writes a novel and try to present spiritual truth, spiritual understanding, spiritual upliftment through this novel? So how is it viewed in contemporary, apart from, of course, Iskcon is there, in the greater Vaishnava tradition, how is it viewed?
Well, as far as, first of all, you could say, how is it viewed today and how is it viewed historically? Well, so far, nobody wants to hang me from the highest tree. So this novel's been out for several months, and I'm just sort of in my normal, somewhat low-level amount of trouble. And so, yeah, I think at this point, devotees there's nothing in the novel which I think would offend the sensibilities of devotees. It's not that there's a guru that smokes imported cigars or something. So yes, and there's nothing which is philosophically wrong or bad or so. I think I think the response has been good.
Has there been a precedent in Iskcon, something like this?
Tamal Krishna Goswami wrote a novel, sort of a novel. It was, many. Yeah, I forget the name in English, but
Yoga for the New Millennium.
Yeah.
21st century.
Of course, he was a great Vaishnava, is a great Vaishnava, but it's kind of like using that format as a platform to preach, like, because he was trying to preach in China. No one could have done what he did in China. It was just an extraordinary achievement, but still, it's like, these Chinese Americans, they're immigrants, I guess, and they meet this really, this tall, handsome Western sannyasi. They invite him to their home, and then basically just the rest of the book is kind of a Bhagavatam class. And so, it's a great book, but okay. So I was trying to, I had a real sense of, how should I put it, sort of literary standards. And I decided early on that I wasn't going to sacrifice the literary standard for the sake of preaching. Mm-hmm. I also wasn't going to sacrifice the Krishna conscious teaching for the sake of, pleasing some people, the novel. So the challenge, which I believe Krishna gave me, the challenge was to write something that really works as literature. But at the same time, it works spiritually. And I think that's the real challenge, because to write something which is kind of people like, but doesn't really have a lot of serious Krishna consciousness, to me is not a challenge. It's just, or to write something that has a lot of Krishna consciousness, but it doesn't really achieve a certain level as literature.
Hmm.
So that was a challenge that Krishna gave me, that it has to work as literature, but it also has to work spiritually. And one, I can't develop one at the expense of the other.
Hmm.
So I have to find a way to present Krishna consciousness, but a way that in no way lessens the quality of the literature as literature.
Hmm.
And so that was the challenge. That was the challenge that and that's why it took me so long, apart from other reasons. But, you know, I had my day job in Iskcon, but because I was just determined not to sacrifice the literary quality for the purity, nor to sacrifice the spiritual quality for the sake of literature.
Literary.
Yeah, so I think that's a real challenge. If someone wants to write, if a devotee wants to write let's say, a novel fiction or whatever, historical fiction or other genres, that's the real challenge. They both have to work. It really has to work as literature,
Hmm.
and it has to work spiritually. Interestingly, in medieval India, there were intellectuals that were totally into literary criticism, and they did very sophisticated work on what makes a good story and what are the standards for a good story. And actually, there was one aspect, one very prominent aspect of that analysis, which Rupa Goswami took and Krishnized, and that is the analysis of rasa. So the 5 primary rasas and the 7 secondary rasas, that was a form of analyzing and critiquing literature, which was prominent among sophisticated intellectuals in India for centuries before Rupa Goswami. And he applied that sort of analytic apparatus, he applied it to Krishna. And analyze Krishna in terms of the rasas, the rasa vichara, rasa analysis. But it really was a long established way of evaluating literature. And so, as I said much earlier, in different times and places, there are different standards. For example, if you look at Lord Chaitanya's debate, Nimai Pandit's debate with the Keshav Kashmiri Pandit, and you see that among intellectuals in India at the time, there was this extremely, sophisticated culture of literary analysis or literary or composition, avoiding logical contradictions and all kinds of that form of writing is called kavya, from the word kavi, because in later Indian languages, kavi came to mean a poet. And so kavya is poetics. And you get a great example of it, just if you read the debate between Nimai Pandit and that Keshav Kashmiri Pandit. And so, but that kind of literature, which Rupa Goswami completely mastered in the different plays he wrote, but that kind of literature, which is the language is very ornamental, it has all kinds of subtleties and intricacies. It's something which is not really done so much nowadays. There's not a big readership. But back then it was, it was the big thing. And so that's just an example of how literary tastes and standards change over time. So that's why I want, I'm trying to present the whole Mahabharata, actually going back 4 generations, because I become deeply fascinated by the 4 generations before Krishna and the Pandavas, and their relationships, and how all the events of those other 4 generations really lead right up to Krishna's appearance. And so I think I spent a lot of time sort of trying to reconstruct the history the century before Krishna came, because first of all, it completely fascinates me, and I think it's really part of Krishna's choreography. I mean, Krishna designed all this, and it's also just mentioned very briefly in the last chapter of the 9th canto of the Bhagavatam, but very, very briefly. So I'm trying to fill it out and reconstruct it. And so that when you don't simply look at, say, the Pandavas or Krishna or Dhritarashtra and all these people, but I want the reader to see the world through their eyes. I want you to see what the world looked like to people who were alive back then. It's just like, for example, if someone's well-read, they have a sense of, you know what's going on in America, there's Europe, there's Russia, there's the Middle East, India, China, and so, if someone is basically well-informed at all, they know kind of what's going on in the world. And so if you were alive back then, you would know all these things. It's just like, I'm sure all of us know that in the 20th century, there were 2 world wars. And you can't really understand what's going on now without understanding that. And, or there was a war in Vietnam, or there was a digital revolution, which has kind of changed everything. And so, so people who were born at the time, people who were alive at the same time of the Pandavas, they were very keenly aware of the preceding generations. I mean, the Pandavas knew all about that. They knew all about it. That was recent history. For example, in America, I mean, anyone in America that's not, deeply ignorant knows that there was slavery, that there was a civil war, that there was all, I mean, you just know these things, just part of living in the world we live in. And so in the same way, there were all kinds of events which are described in the Mahabharata, which I'm reconstructing and trying to fill in, which the Pandavas, for example, or other people at the time, they knew it as much as you know that there were world wars, as much as you know that, in 1947, India became an independent nation, and things like that. There was partition, and I mean, they knew all these things. They knew all these things, and all these prior events had a very heavy influence on everything that was going on when Krishna appeared. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to recreate that historical context so that you feel what it was like to be alive back then. And as a, reasonably well-informed citizen.
Mm.
And I think to really go back to that time, to really go back to the end of Dwapara Yuga and understand it and really live it, you have to know what that world was like. You have to know what those people knew. So that's what I'm doing. And it's really great. It keeps me, out of Vaishnava gang-related activity.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
So any other questions?
Maharaj, there was a question in the chat from Daniel Sullivan.
Oh, let me take a look. I actually have my own little chat here. Oh, what is the novel about? Is that the question?
Yes, Maharaj.
Oh my God, if I tell you that, you have to read it. It's, totally original stuff no one has ever used. Boy meets girl, violence, not between the boy and the girl. But yeah, please go get one. Infomercial alert. So maybe I should put in the chat, Devala Rishi, my disciple, is doing a really good job of getting books to people. It's an Amazon. I think you can find it in Amazon now. You can buy it on Amazon, or you can write to this person, but it is on Amazon. I think that would be easier for you. Oh, that was cool. Did you do that, Ananda Leela? Did you just post that? To learn more about books published by His Holiness. It's amazing to be a holiness, you know. His Holiness Hridayananda Das Goswami. It's like, oh my God, I'm a holiness. Oh yeah, so the information is in the chat. I never thought I was going to grow up to be a holiness. I never thought that I mean, I thought I would do something good in the world, but. So any other questions?
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute if you have any questions. I see we have a hand raised.
Hello. Hare Krishna Maharaj, my obeisances. Thank you
So
so
who's
much.
that? Do you have can you put your camera on?
I can't right now. I'm in a parking lot. My name's Bhagavan Narada. You came here
okay.
to San Antonio some years ago.
Okay, you are manifesting now. Yeah, you're manifesting now as a sort of a yellow line around your box. So go ahead.
Yes. So my question is, recently, my wife, myself, and a few other devotees, we started this like hub for Bhakti arts within Iskcon as like some sort of support or framework. And I feel like my question is sort of seeking some advice. I feel that when we're creating some sort of artistic endeavor, it can become very like intimidating if we're trying to aim towards a secular world for relevance, right? So what advice would you have if we're trying to build this framework or support system amongst each other so we can maintain that balance and not get pulled over too far off the ledge?
I think the danger has been, well, I mean, as you said, it's true. Some people go, get pulled off the ledge. I think one of the biggest problems in Iskcon is not going far enough on the ledge. I think there's if I can just be very honest here, I don't want to offend anyone, but why not? And that is, I think in Iskcon arts in general, I would say the biggest problem is a pervasive amateurism, in the sense of not really. When I started to write the novel, or when I was trying to, simultaneously trying to write it and trying to learn how to write it, and I felt that this is really like a new career for me. It's like if, let's say, for some strange reason, at a certain age in life, I wanted to be a dentist, or definitely wasn't in the cards. Or let's say if I wanted to be, I don't know, a professional golfer or something, or if I wanted to be an engineer, it's a whole career. You have to devote years of your life to learning how to do that. And so I think that, and I don't mean to criticize or demean anyone, but I think Iskcon is kind of, and the devotees in general, not just Iskcon, are kind of plagued by this amateurism. And I think it's true in music. I think it's true in art. I think in literature, and or just like the quick fix, you just sort of bring in some Indian stuff. Indian culture, let's say like the arts, like dance and music, or even painting, and so on. I mean, of course, it's impressive. I mean, they're good, sincere people who master a certain type of art, but it doesn't speak so much to a non-Indian audience or a non-devotee audience. And of course, you can measure this. I mean, this is just totally quantifiable. It's mathematical, because you can just see like how many people purchase, let's say, Indian music, how many people who are not Indians, and let's say who are not devotees, or they belong to some other Indian-based movement, some yoga movement, just how many people in general buy that music. If there's for example, a Bharatanatyam performance in Cincinnati or in Milwaukee or, you know, wherever. So why? I'm really kind of like skewing to the Midwest there. But anyway, so let's, how many people go? If you go to one of those performances and see how many people, how many non-Indians bought tickets for it. So the fact is that if we really, oh, there you are, good old Bhagavan Narda. So I think if we really want to reach a broad mainstream audience, I don't think we can just personally, and I don't mean to in any way criticize or minimize the devotional service of devotees who do try to appeal to that audience, sort of the Indophile audience, either with their music or their art or writing, whatever. I mean, you know, many of them are really good devotees, very sincere, Krishna conscious. And, but I just personally find it, personally, this is just me, kind of claustrophobic. In the sense that, of course, we want to reach those people, but I think I also want to reach the world. And so it's kind of like if you just do it Indian style, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's, you know, it's an impressive classical culture, but if we want to reach the modern world, it's a lot harder. If you just kind of do it, you know, Indian style, there's sort of a built-in audience. And you don't really have to be that good, although some devotees are very good at the, you know, some devotees are very talented and skilled and so on. But I think to reach the world, to really have impact, you know, with mainstream society, it's very difficult. You have to really, really work hard. You have to become really good at what you're doing. And that's what I'm aiming at.
I think there's a part of it too, where it's like, we can get criticized by devotees, and that can kind of like, for it not being pure enough, or, you know, it not being, I guess, you know, cultural enough. And I think,
yeah, but to take Indian as a synonym for cultural, in my view, is just trying to think. I'm trying to be nice here, but I mean, all the words that are coming to my mind are not so nice. Let's say I think it's a tragic misunderstanding of reality. I mean, what Krishna, I mean, the idea that only Indian things are pure, first of all, Prabhupada totally rejected that, and I think any sane person would reject that. What Krishna actually recommends or enjoins in the Bhagavad Gita is culture of the mode of goodness. First of all, half of Indian culture comes from Muslims. And there I'm including music and art, you know, and some forms of architecture and, you know, cuisine. I mean, a lot of it, more than most devotees imagine, is you know, coming from the Muslim side. Because if you look at India, even though numerically, of course, that there are far more Hindus and Muslims in India, but the Muslims were in charge for a long time. And they, you know, they had the purse string. So if you were an artist, if you were, or let's say especially a musician, you had to have a patron. Someone had to pay for it. And there wasn't public performance. It's not like nowadays, like you just rent a venue and then you go and your band plays and a lot of people buy tickets and you make money. It wasn't like that. Or if a lot of people download your music, it wasn't like that. Like, for example, in Europe, up till really the Industrial Revolution, really getting into the early 1800s, I mean, before that, the Baroque period, the patrons were either the church or the nobles. And you had to, if you didn't have a patron, you know, music was not going to be your day job. And so in the same way in India, the kings were the patrons and the kings were Muslims. And that's why the Muslims dominated for centuries, and still do actually, Indian classical music, especially in North India. So this idea that something's not cultural unless it's Indian, I think is, and with absolutely no negative idea intended toward Indian culture, But the idea that it exclusively is just culture in general, just culture, I think is a bit mindless. It's a bit mindless. And, and that's not at all what Krishna teaches. Krishna teaches mode of goodness. So I think that's what's really, in a sense, holding things back, among other things, is that we need people. If someone really feels their calling is music or literature or visual arts, I mean, if you're aiming high, if you really want to reach the world and not just little subcultures, then it's very hard work. It's very hard work. You have to really, really, really work at it and just practice. It's very hard. And so, it's easy. Most people just don't want to work that hard, so they just take the easy way out. And they reach their little niche audience, little niche audience, and that's the end of it. And the Hare Krishna movement continues to be essentially not happening in the Western world. So that's how I see it. Just to be blunt and honest, that's how I see it.
Maharaj, is there a chance I can maybe connect with you for a few minutes off Zoom at some point, sometime?
Sure.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, have your lawyer call my lawyer.
Sure.
Maharaj,
Yes.
my name is Danny Sullivan. I've been following you for a long time, so I really feel blessed that I get to finally meet you. And my question is a little off subject, but my question is, a long time ago, I was told that you're an amazing historian. So I always wondered what happened to the Catholic Church and why they all of a sudden allowed the slaughter of animals.
I don't know if they all of a sudden allowed it.
No, I meant, years, way back when.
Basically, we could talk literally for hours and hours and hours about Christian history, which I've studied a lot. But I'll just make one simple point. And that is, when Jesus was living, all of his followers, all of the people who were part of the sort of itinerant community that accompanied Jesus around Israel, all of them were Jewish. All the apostles were Jewish. And no one, including the apostles, thought that Jesus had intended to create or had created a new religion. And this is mainstream academic scholarship. It's not just, some special idea I have. That's mainstream scholarship that even Paul of Tarsus, another topic, no one thought that he was, in fact, you have Jesus in the Bible saying, in the New Testament saying that I have not come to change the law, not one letter of the law, which was, of course, kind of the essence of the Jewish approach to religion, the covenant, which is a legal contract, people of the covenant. And so what happened is, for various historical reasons, within a few generations, there was a radical demographic shift in the Jesus movement, where it became a pagan movement. And I think really in the full sense of the word, because after he was crucified, I won't go into all the history, we could talk about that for a long time, but Jewish people stopped joining because it was illegal for them to do so, and because the Messiah wins a military victory normally, and Jesus was kind of, at least superficially, crushed by the Roman state. And so it became a pagan movement, and they brought all kinds of pagan ideas. And so there was really there was a radical transformation. And not that nothing was carried over. But so in terms of, why did they kill animals? Or, I mean, clearly there were vegetarian Christians back then, but it went in many different directions. There were many kinds of Christianity. I'm sure there were vegetarian Christian groups. There were all kinds of Christianities back then. It was very diverse. And what brought it all together, so there was like a church, was not that everyone saw the light and decided we'll all do it the same way. Rather, it was done through violence, or the threat of violence, when the Roman Emperor Constantine decided to promote Christianity. And at that point, it became dangerous to be a heretic, meaning anyone that didn't agree with a group of bishops. And so at that point, it went. So if you study the history of it, it's not like a bunch of just sort of wandering mystics who, why didn't they get it? We shouldn't kill animals. It was, there's a very complicated history involving all kinds of human factors, political factors, military. There were, the way Christianity developed depended to a great extent on military history. Because once the Romans adopted it, there were all kinds of competing Roman factions, and generally they settled their disputes on battlefields. And so the forms of Christianity that became prominent depended a lot on military history. So yeah, that's a whole topic.
Thank you.
So any other question? If not, I'll get back to work.
I'm going to put the link in the chat for Amazon for anybody that is interested in purchasing the book now. It's available on Amazon, as you said, in the Kindle version. So if you can't wait for the hard copy and you must start reading it this evening, you can purchase it on the Kindle version. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to read your book. I teach elementary school writing, and
Oh, really?
I can't wait to hear and see the eyes of through Justin. Yeah. So I'm really excited about this, because I'm always telling my students to go into the eyes, into the skin of the reader, to see what they would be experiencing. So I'm really excited, and I can't wait to read it. When you told the story, did you tell it through the perspective? You told it through the perspective of Justin, from his perspective on how he was reading the story?
Yeah, I did. He's the sort of what they call the point of view character.
Mm-hmm.
That's very nice. I mean, I'm really happy that you're going to read it. And
do you think that it would be something that would be suitable for 10, 11-year-olds?
I would say, though, 10, 11-year-olds that are kind of they're sort of smart, have good vocabulary.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. It was so nice to hear from you. We're so excited to read your book and to hear of all of your future endeavors that are coming. Will the new books on the Mahabharata be a series, or will it be an individual book, one book?
It looks like, the way it's going, it looks like it may be at least 6 volumes.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. So it'll be like almost like a life companion that you sort of, you can just, it'll be like a literary companion for your life. But thank you very much. I appreciate your service, and I appreciate your helping to facilitate this program.
Thank you so much for joining us and enlightening us, Maharaj. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Dear devotees, I just have a few announcements. If you would like to just stay for one moment, I'll put them in the chat. If you are interested in joining our WhatsApp group for to come and hear from our future speakers, you can also check out our YouTube channel, where you can see past speakers that have graced us with their presence. And also, please check out the farm program in Houston if you're in the area. I don't think that Laura is here this evening, but I'm going to put the link in the in the chat as well. I'll put the address to the farm. If you're in the area, please feel free to check it out. They do wonderful programs there, as well as some yoga programs. And that's all for this evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And please join our WhatsApp group and have a wonderful weekend. Hare Krishna.